Today I'm going to talk you through the social influence topic. This is a really brief overview of everything that's within the topic. It hits your AO1, so your descriptions, and also your AO3, so evaluating each different concept. It doesn't, however, touch on AO2. The only thing I would say about AO2, which is application, is that you would take the concepts I'm going to talk you through and you would be very explicit in the situation or scenario that you've been given in an exam. So within this video, we're going to look at the definitions that come under social influence. We're going to look at situational explanations for them, the dispositional explanations. We're going to look through the 2 core studies and also all of the criticisms that you will need to know. So that's your AO3 there, is the criticisms. We're going to start off with conformity. So by definition, conformity is yielding to group pressures. So that is changing your behaviour in order to fit into a group. The situational factor to explain conformity is titled majority influence. So again, majority influence is all about fitting in with that group, fitting in with a majority. And there are 2 types of majority influence. Number 1 is normative majority influence. This is when you conform outwardly, so you appear to have changed your behaviour to agree with the group, but you have not changed your internal opinion. So although you're doing the behaviour to fit in with the group, inside you do not believe in that. You've got your own belief that has not changed. You're just changing your external behaviour. The opposite to that is informative majority influence. So this is where you internalise the opinion. That means that you take the opinion of the group and you believe that to be true as well. So you're conforming both outwardly in your behaviour and also inwardly in your beliefs. Informative social influence or majority influence is common in situations where you're not sure or it's not clear what the correct answer is or what the correct behaviour is. So that's when you're most likely to see informative majority influence. Now the studies go along with this. It's not a core study, but it is one that demonstrates both normative and informative majority influence, and that is Ash in 1956. So if you remember Ash, he had different lengths of lines, and he had a participant in a group of Confederates. Remember, a Confederate is somebody who is paid by the experimental psychologist to behave in a certain way. So they're in on the experiment, if you like, an actor. So in Ash's study, you had to identify which line length was most similar to a particular line that they'd given you. Now, 12 out of 18 times, participants actually gave the wrong answer. So they changed their answer to agree with the group. So for example, the Confederate might have said, I think it is line 2, even though the answer was clearly line 3. So the participant went along with the group 12 out of 18 times. In the debriefing sessions, Ash said to them, why did you agree? Why did you give this answer? Some of them demonstrated normative majority influence. They said they knew they were wrong, but they didn't want to appear silly or not fit in with the group, so they just gave the wrong answer. Some of them showed informative majority influence in that they weren't entirely sure, so they thought they would go along with the group. So Ash is a really good example of majority influence there. Now, there is some evaluation that goes along with majority influence. So on a negative way, we think it's an invalid representation of behaviour. So people will conform in some situations, but not others. Now that means it's really hard to predict behaviour. Is there much point in having a theory that only applies to some situations, particularly when we're not sure which situations it will apply to or not? So it may not represent behaviour truly or validly in all situations. Additionally, not everyone conforms in the same way. Now, there is evidence to suggest that people who are raised in collectivist cultures may actually conform more. We'll look more about collectivism and individualism in pro-social behaviour in a moment. So it might not explain, or it might not be generalisable to everybody. So that's the situational factor to explain conformity. There is also a dispositional factor. So dispositional factor is to do with yourself, your personality, individual differences, those kinds of things. So the dispositional factor is to do with self-esteem. The definition of self-esteem, that is how we perceive ourselves. Now, typically people can have low self-esteem, they can have high self-esteem. If you are someone who has low self-esteem, that means you've got a low opinion of yourself. you're not confident in your actions, and you are more likely to conform. If you're not confident in your behaviour, you're much more likely to go along with the group compared to those who are more confident or might have higher self-esteem. There is also a neuropsychology or neuropsychological explanation to go along with that. And that has to do with the hippocampus. So this is right in the centre of your brain towards the bottom of it. And what we've found is that if you have low self-esteem, it's actually correlated. So there's an association with reduced grey matter in the hippocampus. So grey matter is brain tissue. So people with low self-esteem have also been found to have reduced brain tissue in this particular area in the brain. The hippocampus deals with emotion, amongst other things, such as memory. So there is potentially a link here. Now, we can't say that one causes the other, but there is just an association there. Now, of course, to hit the AO3, there is an evaluation to go along with the dispositional factor for conformity, and there are a couple. Firstly, it is quite reductionist. What this means is that it ignores evidence that we're influenced by others around us. Now, realistically, we know that behaviour is determined also by others around us and partly by yourself. So by ignoring the fact that people change their behaviour based on who they're with, it really reduces it. It simplifies behaviour and it ignores that other factor. The other negative evaluation is that there's too much focus on individuals. So we can't necessarily generalise these findings to other people. We could say this is true in this person, but because it's a dispositional factor, which means it's going to vary person to person, we cannot then use it to explain the behaviour of other people. And therefore, again, is there much point in having a theory that means we cannot predict behaviour? So that is a very quick tour through conformity. We are now going to move on to look at obedience. So the definition of obedience is following orders from someone we perceive as having more authority than us. That could be a parent, a teacher, an adult, a policeman, anyone who we think has more power than us. Now, there are, of course, a situational factor to explain obedience and also the dispositional. We'll start off with the situational factor. And the situational factor is having an authority figure. Now, this authority figure may be legitimate in that they do have more power than you, or it may be illegitimate. So you might just perceive them as having more power even though they do not. But authority figures typically have the power to punish you, which is why you will follow their orders to avoid this punishment. To go along with this, then, there is something called agency theory. This was developed by Milgram, and he suggested that people will obey orders that they know to be wrong as they act as agents of the authority figure. What that means is they're not acting on their own thoughts, they're acting on behalf of somebody else, and therefore they should not be responsible for their actions. They're just acting in this agentic state. Now, in Milgram's classic experiment, he got people to administer electric shocks to Confederates in another room. Now, the participant did not know that they were Confederates. They believed that they were giving electric shocks to a real person. And in fact, 65% of the participants obeyed the order to give the fatal shock of 450 volts. Now, the participants knew that this was a fatal level of shock. It was clearly labelled on the machine, yet 65% of them still gave that shock. Milgram said this was because of agency theory. They were just obeying the order from the experimenter. He was giving them prompts to continue, and so they obeyed because of this. Now, there are, of course, some evaluations of agency theory. Firstly, it is very deterministic. Determinism is the opposite to free will. So this suggests that we have no free will over our behaviour. So our behaviour is predetermined for us. We cannot influence how we behave. Another drawback of this theory is that it does not explain why some people obey, whereas others do not. So although 65% did obey, 35% still did not. That's quite a significant amount of people. So there is no explanation as to why they did not obey Milgram's instructions. The final evaluation point for this situational factor is that it suggests that people should not be held accountable for atrocious acts. So if you remember back to the lesson on this, we talked about Adolf Eichmann. He was a Nazi, and he was responsible for killing a lot of people in concentration camps. Now, he believed that he should not have been punished for his behaviour, but he was trialled and he was sentenced to the death penalty. Now, according to this theory of agency theory, Adolf Eichmann shouldn't have been punished. Although he was responsible for all those deaths, in his mind, he was just acting on behalf of Hitler. And so this theory suggests that we shouldn't punish people who commit these atrocious crimes. So that's our situational factor. There is also a dispositional factor to go along with this, and that is the authoritarian personality. So authoritarian personality, this is when an individual has been raised very strictly, particularly by their father. They will obey them blindly, so they'll follow all their orders, and they will treat anyone that they view as inferior to themselves poorly. So anyone they don't think is good as them, they will treat them very badly. Now, the psychologist who came up with this was Adorno, and he created the F scale, F standing for fascism. And he created this to measure this personality type. And he found that people who have this authoritarian personality see the world in black and white, meaning that if you've done something wrong, you've done something wrong, you need to be punished. There's no middle ground, no grey area, it's right or wrong. He says that they will offer blind obedience to anyone they think is superior to themselves, so they will follow all instructions. They're contemptuous and prejudiced against those who are inferior to themselves, and they are very conformist. So he particularly found this in people who have been raised by very strict parents, particularly their fathers. And he suggested that actually they grew up this resentment towards their fathers, and instead of taking it out on them, they take it out on those who they view as inferior. So that is the authoritarian personality, the dispositional factor to explain obedience. Now, it is limited, however. This only offers an explanation for those who have been raised in very strict and harsh environments. It doesn't explain why people who have not been raised harshly still follow orders and obey. There's no explanation for that. So it is a limited theory. Now, related to the topic of obedience, there is the first of the core studies in the social influence topic, and that was conducted by Bickman in 1974. Now, Bickman was interested in the social power of a uniform. So will people obey orders from someone in plain clothes, someone in a low authority uniform, which was a milkman, and someone in a high authority uniform, which was a guard? So he did 3 experiments. In the first experiment, he used an independent measures design for a field experiment. So this meant that different participants did different conditions, and he was out in the real world conducting the experiment out and about. He had 153 adult participants, and he roughly estimated their ages rather than asking them for them. And the way that he recruited his sample was through opportunity. So if they were on the street passing by, he would just say, he would just start the experiment essentially, and they would be involved. Now, there were 3 scenarios that he investigated in experiment 1. Number 1 was asking somebody to pick up a paper bag off the floor, a bit of litter. Number 2 was telling someone or asking them if they have a dime, which is a coin, money, for parking. And number 3, there was a sign that says no standing at a bus stop, and he was telling people that applies to you, you're not allowed to stand at this bus stop, whereas in fact it actually applies to the cars driving past. This was done in New York as well, out in the field. So those were the 3 scenarios. And what he actually found, so here is the graph direct from the textbook. He found that in all 3 scenarios, so the paper bag, the diamond parking meter, and the bus stop scenario, the obedience was higher when the individual was wearing a guard uniform. He found that the milkman uniform did have somewhat higher obedience rates compared to the everyday plainclothes person. So that was his first experiment. He then moved on to experiment number 2. Experiment number 2, he looked at just the parking meter scenario. So saying, do you have a dime for the parking meter. That gentleman over there doesn't have any money. But this time, not only did he look at the difference of uniforms, he also looked at the impact of surveillance. So in one condition, he would say, do you have a dime for this gentleman? And then he would walk away. In the other scenario, he would stay there and he would observe. That was the surveillance condition. And actually, he found that surveillance had no impact on obedience. So hanging around and making sure the person followed the instruction had no impact on the rate of obedience. Finally, he did experiment number 3. This one was slightly different in that it was a questionnaire for university students, and he asked them, he gave them lots of different scenarios, and he said, would you obey the individual in this scenario? And that was kind of it for the whole questionnaire. Now, participants thought, or from their results, we concluded that participants thought that uniform would have no impact on rates of obedience. So this suggests that how people think they would behave in a scenario is very different to how they actually behave. So these people thought they would not obey a guard more than they would obey a milkman. If we go back to the graph in experiment 1, we see that actually clearly people do obey the guard more than they obey the milkman. So how we think we will act is very different to how we actually do act. Now, of course, along with all of the other topics, there are some criticisms that you need to know. Number 1, he used opportunity sampling. Now, although this is very easy and convenient, it does mean that you might not have a representative sample, so you cannot generalize the results, but also the unknown factors might have impacted behaviour. For example, one of the participants might have been going to a job interview, in which case they could not have been late, so they might have not have obeyed because they had to get somewhere they needed to get to. So because he didn't debrief, we don't know what those unknown factors were, or if anyone did have something they had to get to. Therefore, there are other factors that could have explained behaviour that we are not necessarily aware of. Number 2, it was a field experiment. It was done out on the streets of New York rather than in a lab. What this means is that you have very little control over extraneous variables. So those are variables other than the independent variable and the dependent variable that can impact the dependent variable. So for example, the weather. If it was raining, people might have obeyed less because they wanted to get out of the rain quickly. So he had no control over that, and that could have affected the results. The third criticism is there was a gender bias. All of the Confederates, so the person dressed as the milkman, the plainclothes, and as the guard, they were all male. The results might have been significantly different if it was a female Confederate. Next, it was culturally biased. This is because it took place in one location, New York, in America. Therefore, it is not representative of other places in America and also other countries. So we cannot generalize the findings of Bickman's study beyond New York, or that street in New York. The final criticism of Bickman's study is that it was very unethical. Now, although this will not affect the actual results, it's not allowed. It's very poor practice to go against ethical guidelines. But the reason it was unethical is because consent was firstly not obtained from the participants. He just went up to them and said, do you have a dime for the parking meter? Pick up that litter, or whatever. So they could not consent to being part of this study. Secondly, they were deceived. They did not know they were in a study. He gave them instructions. So, for example, the dime condition, he said, this person does not have money for the parking meter, give them some money. He had lied to them. The person might have had money for it, and they were part of a study. The participant might have felt embarrassed being asked to pick up litter or doing something in the street, so they were not protected from psychological harm. And finally, they were not debriefed, which means they were not then told, oh, by the way, you were in a study, this is what it's for, you're free to withdraw your data. They didn't know any of that, so it was unethical. That is a quick overview of all of obedience. The next definitions that we will look at are pro-social behaviour and anti-social behaviour. So starting off with pro-social then, as the name suggests, these are actions that benefit society and its members. Whereas anti-social is the opposite. These are actions that go against society and often are harmful. So we'll start with pro-social behaviour. Now, the situational explanations for pro-social behaviour are to do with being raised in a collectivist culture. So in collectivist cultures, the view is that the group need is much more important than individual need, and therefore this will result in a lot more pro-social behaviour. A lot of this research was done in children and looking at those children who have been raised in a collectivist culture. They might be helping out with the chores more and helping to take care of their younger siblings, and therefore demonstrating more pro-social behaviour, so helping the need of the family, the group, rather than their individual needs. Now, this is also a limitation of the situational explanation for pro-social behaviour, and that is the fact that it is only conducted on children. We cannot therefore assume that the behaviour will be the same in adults. They might behave differently. The dispositional explanation for pro-social behaviour is looking at moral development. So your morals are your beliefs, your values, what you think is right and wrong. Now, there was a psychologist called Kohlberg, and he developed his stages and levels of moral reasoning. There are 3 levels: pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional, and 2 stages in every level. Now, he suggested that individuals in later stages of moral development show lots more pro-social behaviour. Now, there is a drawback of Kohlberg's research. Firstly, it is not generalisable. That means we cannot apply his findings or his theory of the different levels and stages beyond those in Western cultures. All of his research was done in Western cultures, therefore it's highly biased. It does not consider that different cultures might have different views on morality. So that is a big drawback for Kohlberg. There is another limitation for Kohlberg's moral development theory, in that it is gender biased. To come up with this theory, he did a longitudinal study, so that meant that he followed a group of children from a young age, many, many years, until they were much older. Now, the group of children that he followed was only comprised of males. Now, another psychologist called Billingham, they suggested that females tend to focus more on caring to do with their moral development, whereas males focus more on justice in terms of moral development. So we cannot assume that Kohlberg's theory applies beyond males. So those are 2 limitations there of moral development as dispositional factors to explain pro-social behaviour. If we look at the opposite, which is antisocial behaviour, I'll start with the dispositional factor again, which is moral development. As I said, there were 3 different levels in Kohlberg's theory and 2 stages within each level. Now, psychologists think that being in stage 2 of his theory is correlated with antisocial behaviour. So in stage 2, individuals are looking at anything they do for other people to be returned. So it's very egocentric, which means they are focusing on themselves only. So being in that stage 2 is much more you're much more likely to show antisocial behaviour. Notice that it says correlation. Again, this is not causation. We cannot say for definite that being in stage 2 causes more antisocial behaviour, but it is linked with an increase. Now, for moral development, there is a neuropsychological explanation, and that is damage to the prefrontal cortex. That is the part of your brain right at the front, and that's to do with decision-making, planning, forward thinking, those kind of higher level cognitive processes. Now, people with damage to their prefrontal cortex are more likely to show faulty moral reasoning. So this suggests that perhaps that your brain structure, if the prefrontal cortex particularly is damaged, then you're less likely to show pro-social behaviour because it's linked with faulty moral reasoning. Now, there is also a situational factor that can explain antisocial behaviour, and that is income inequality and also socioeconomic status. So in countries where there are greater differences between the wealthiest people and the poorest people, so a huge income gap, there is more antisocial behaviour recorded in those countries. Additionally, people with lower socioeconomic status So they tend to show more antisocial behaviour again. Now notice how these are still correlations. We cannot say for definite that being of low socioeconomic status or being in a country that shows great income inequality definitely causes antisocial behaviour, but it is linked with more antisocial behaviour. So that's prosocial and antisocial. We'll talk about these again when we look at the key study organised by NatCen. Moving on now to crowd behaviour and collective behaviour. So by definition, crowd behaviour is a group of people who have come together for a particular reason, whereas collective behaviour describes the behaviour of two or more individuals who are acting collectively, so with one another. Now, the situational and dispositional factors to explain these, they apply to both crowd and collective behaviour. So we will start with the situational factors. So first up, we've got a common social identity. So people who might share similar cultures, a background and interest, they might form what's called an in-group. So everyone who identifies with that background or particular interest, they are within the in-group. If you're someone who does not have that interest, you are part of the out-group. So people within the in-group, they might act negatively towards the out-group because you do not have that common social identity. So that might result in negative behaviour. Related to that is de-individuation. So de-individuation is the idea that you lose your sense of individuality when you're in a group. So you feel more anonymous and less accountable for your actions. So for example, if you're involved in a riot as part of a big group, you think there's lots of us here, I won't be identified, I'm a small part of a large group, then you might start behaving in ways that you wouldn't normally act because you don't think you'll get caught because you are part of this much larger group. Now, the criticism of this theory is that it very much focuses on antisocial behaviour. De-individuation and having this common social identity, it does not always lead to violence. That's really important to remember. It can sometimes be a pleasant experience or a neutral one. For example, if lots of people come together to go to a concert, they might just be enjoying the music. It still might be part of de-individuation, but they're just enjoying themselves. They're not acting violently. So that is a drawback of this explanation. The dispositional explanation for crowd and collective behaviour is something called locus of control. You might see this abbreviated as LOC. Now, there are two types of locus of control, loci for plural. Number one is an internal locus of control. So that is when you believe you have control over your life. You think, my actions are because I want to do that. If you pass a test, it's because you have worked hard to pass it. If you failed a test, you're going to take that really personally. It's completely your fault. You didn't do enough to study, that kind of thing. So people with internal loci of control, they're more likely to be middle-aged. And they're confident that they have the ability to control their life. The other type then is external locus of control. This is the opposite. That believes you have very little to no control over your life. People with external loci of control are much more likely to be younger and elderly, perhaps because these are times in your life where you're not quite as independent and do have to rely on others to help you. Now, people with an external locus of control are much more likely to follow their crowd. This is because they believe they don't have much control over their behaviour. They're very easily influenced by those around them. So they're much more likely to get involved in this crowd behaviour. Now, locus of control is not a great explanation. The reason being is because your locus of control can change depending on the situation you are in. For example, when you're at home, you might have an internal locus of control, so you have a bit more control over your life, particularly as you're getting older. Your parents might give you a bit more freedom. Whereas when you're at school, you might have an external locus of control because it's very regimented. You have to follow the instructions of your teacher. You have to adhere to the timings of the day. You have much less control over your life and behaviour, essentially. So because the locus of control can change, it makes behaviour a lot harder to predict. Again, this is not useful. There is not much point in having a theory that does not apply to behaviour most of the time. if we can't predict when your locus of control is going to be internal or external, we therefore can't predict whether you're more or less likely to follow the crowd behaviour, and therefore it's not really a useful theory. We're now going to look at examples of crowd and collective behaviour and also antisocial behaviour with your key study. The final key study for social influence was conducted by NatCen, and within that it was by a psychologist called Morel and then et al. Et al. Means and others, 2011. So that means it was Morel, the psychologist, and others with him who or her who conducted this study. So the background of the NatCen study. This is all based on the Tottenham riots in 2011. So between the 6th of August and the 11th of August 2011, there were protests going on about the fatal shooting of a man called Mark Duggan. So people believed that he should not have been shot. They thought it could have been a race issue, and so there was lots of peaceful protesting happening. Now, the peaceful protesting escalated and it turned into a riot. So the method then, they had 36 participants that they interviewed, and the interviews took place 5 weeks after the riot. They wanted it to be quite quickly after the riots, but obviously they needed time to get the ethical approval and to work out what they were going to investigate. So the three main things they wanted to find out was, number one, what happened in the London riots? Number two, who was involved? Number three, why and how were people involved? So let's look at then who was involved. Now, there were 4 categories of people that were involved. Firstly, there were the watchers. So these were young people who were present during the incidents and they observed what happened, but they were not personally involved in the rioting and the looting. Now, we could separate this group of watchers into 2 people. Number one, the bystanders. So these were young people who just happened to be there. They might have lived nearby, they were passing through, and they just happened to come across the riots. Number 2 were the curious. So the curious people, so they were deliberately there. They wanted to go and see what was happening. So that was the first group of people. Secondly, we have the rioters. So we could categorize the rioters into 3 subcategories. Number 1, the protesters. So these were people who were acting out deliberately because they were upset about the death of Mark Duggan. There were the retaliators. So these were people who acted out to get their own back on the system or against the police. Typically in Tottenham, there have been a lot of riots historically, and people didn't really trust authority and the police, so this was a good chance to get back at them. There were also the thrill seekers. So these were the people who got involved because they liked the excitement or the buzz of being part of a riot. The third category of people were called looters. So looters are people who steal things, they break into the shops, they stole anything that had been left out on the street. So that's what the looters were. Now you could categorize these into opportunists, so people who saw the chance to steal things for themselves or for their family that they might needed. And then there were also the sellers. So these are people who planned their involvement. They knew they were going to get involved so they could steal, for example, so many big TVs, stereos, whatever, to then sell on and get good profits. So those were the looters. Finally, there was the non-involved. These were young people who did not take part in the riots. Now we've got number 1, the stayaways. So they were young people who chose to not get involved or to observe. So they actively made that decision. Secondly, there were the wannabes, the people who wanted to be there, but they weren't actually. So that's how they worked out who was involved. They've got these 4 categories with each with at least 2 subcategories. So the next big question is, why did people get involved? And they group this into dispositional factors and other factors. So if we look at the dispositional factors, we've got number 1, previous criminal activity. Now they said that there were nudge factors and tug factors. Nudge factors were factors that encouraged people to get involved with the riots. Tug were factors that did not, or they discouraged people to get involved. So the nudge factor here was that it's easy to get involved. This is what happens around here. As I said, there have been many other riots before in Tottenham. So it's easy to get involved when you're used to it happening. The tug factor might have been, though, that they've been caught once before, they knew what the risks were, they don't want to have that again. The next dispositional factor was your attitude, or their attitude, towards authority. So if they had negative views of politicians and authority figures, and also negative previous experiences with the police, they're going to be much more likely to get involved. Perhaps they were the retaliators. They wanted to riot and loot for this reason. The tug factor here would be having no negative experience with the police. So they didn't have any experience there, not really a reason for them to get involved. The final dispositional factor was the prospect of the person. If they had poor job prospects, they were on low income, they had limited hope for the future, they might have thought that they had nothing to lose. So they thought, I might as well get involved. It's not going to do me any harm. In contrast, they're the tug factor. If they were working, or they've got expectations of future work, or high expectations and aspirations for the future, they've got a lot at stake there. They don't want to lose out on those future opportunities. And so they were less likely to get involved. So those were the dispositional factors. The other factors, there were 4 of them. Number 1, family attitudes. So there are lots of different families involved. Some of them might have not disapproved of rioting, therefore you'll be more likely to get involved. However, they might have been from a family they were not brought up to get involved in riots, and the relatives might have disapproved quite heavily of rioting, and therefore that would have been a tug factor. The second will be community. So if you were attached to a community with a culture of this low-level criminal activity, so rioting is quite a common thing, it's very much normalised, you're more likely to get involved. If you're more attached to a community with pro-social values, for example, a religious community, you'd be less likely to get involved in that riot. The third one was to do with a sense of belonging. If you have a little sense of ownership in society, you're going to be much more likely to get involved in the riot. If you did have a sense of ownership in society, then you would be less likely to get involved. Finally, poverty and materialism. So the nudge factor there would be that if you wanted these material goods, but you didn't have the money to pay for them, Tottenham was quite a deprived area, so many people might not be able to afford these many goods they might have wanted. So they might have stole them, because when else would they get the opportunity to do so? The tug factor there being if you had adequate resources to purchase the goods, so perhaps they were in work, they were getting a decent income, so they could afford to purchase the goods. They didn't see any need to loot, and therefore they didn't get involved there. So that's how, from the interviews, that's what they worked out as the different nudge and tug factors of why people did get involved. The final thing that we need to talk about are the criticisms of this study. Firstly, it was very difficult to recruit participants. This is because it happened 5 weeks after the riots in an area typically where the police were viewed as quite negative people. So not many people would have stepped forward there to get involved in the interviews, and therefore it might have been quite an unrepresentative sample of individuals who took part in the interviews. Secondly, there might have been some evidence of social desirability bias, in that these participants were being interviewed. Now, if they were involved in the criminal activity, the researchers said they weren't going to report it to the police. However, if they discussed any future criminal activity that they were planning on, then that would have to be disclosed to the police. So the participants might have given an answer or answers to make them look good. So they might have lied, essentially. Social desirability bias, they don't want to appear negatively. They want to have a good perception of them. Therefore, they might have lied to achieve this. Thirdly, it was self-report. So that means participants give their account. Now, if they did not trust authority, they might have lied about their involvement, even though they were told that they wouldn't be punished for any involvement in the riot. They might not have trusted this fully, and they perhaps might have left out information of their full involvement to avoid going to prison. Finally, memory is unreliable. Its memory is constructed. So if you have a discussion with someone after the event, their telling of the event might impact your memory of the event. So these discussions might have distorted the participant's memory, and therefore it might not have been an accurate account of what actually happened. Now, this is a subconscious process, so they might not have actively been lying. They just truly believe that their account was true, even if it might not have been. So that is a very quick overview of every topic in social influence. Remember, there are supporting studies of lots of the theories I've talked about that I have not mentioned in this video. So do look back at the Google slides that I've uploaded onto the classroom for these. But yeah, that's social influence.